Hello and welcome to Culture in Between, a podcast all about exploring the unique experiences of people who grew up in a culture outside of their parents' culture. We're your hosts, Alyssa and Brianna, and today we have Tammi, who grew up with Korean parents. Thank you, Tammi, so much for joining us. We're really excited to get to interview you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I've never been on a podcast, so this is so exciting for me.
Yeah, well, we've never hosted a podcast,
Yeah,
so
so
it's the first
a lot of
time
new
for
things,
all of
everybody.
us. Yeah. So Tammi, can you give us a little brief introduction to yourself?
Yeah, I'm out here in the Seattle area. This is where I grew up. My parents immigrated here in the early 90s. They came when my brother was a baby and just lived here my whole life. Met Brianna in college out in Baltimore.
Yes, Tammi and I met. We were both studying vocal performance at a music conservatory in Baltimore. Very, very exciting. So, Tammi, can you tell us where exactly in South Korea your parents are from?
Yeah, they're from the south in a city called Busan, which is like the biggest city in the south, known as kind of like known for like seafood and being on the coast. I love it there.
Yeah, I've heard about it a little bit. I think there's like a movie or something called like Train to Busan or
Yeah.
something. Yeah, and like
That's like a zombie apocalypse
yeah,
movie.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We don't have to. I
It's
know
a
it's
really
not
good
like
though. I really like that
I've
movie.
heard a lot about it. Yeah, and then and I've just seen like pictures of it, and yeah, that's really nice. So awesome.
How like often do you get to go over there, or have you been, I guess?
Yeah, I've been like a good number of times throughout my life. So I was born here, and then like it's kind of like every few years that I would go, and sometimes I would go alone or with my brother. I have an older brother because it's just so expensive to go all together, the four of us. So yeah, sometimes our parents would just send us, the two of us, and we'd just go hang out with our family for like a couple weeks over the summer. But more recently, really just coincidentally, I've been the past 3 years in a row, just for like family stuff. And then like this year, my brother got married there. He's been living there for the past 2.5 years, and he met his now wife, my sister-in-law, there through some friends. And then yeah, he had his wedding there. So I've been a good number of times. So I don't really know my way around too well, but nowadays with technology, maps and
Yeah.
stuff, it's pretty easy. And then I sometimes ask family to drive me around places or take me places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
What's the
yeah,
flight like from Seattle? How like long of, or I guess what do you typically have to do to get there?
it's pretty long. So they're at least from Seattle and like the West Coast, mostly Seattle and LA. There are direct flights out to Korea, and it's typically about 10 hours. I kind of see it as more of like a red eye, where basically I just like get on and I try to sleep for as
Yeah.
long as
Yeah,
possible.
yeah.
But that's really hard in economy.
Yes, yes.
Yep,
So
yep.
true.
I
I'm
swear
like,
they're making those seats smaller.
Yes.
seriously, I'm like, where do I? There's no place for me to put my feet. Like, I'm not a
Yes.
small child anymore, so it's
Yeah, and
so
you and me are like
uncomfortable.
very average size people. I feel like, and like I just can't imagine because like my husband's like 6'2", and he's always like, "I'm
Oh,
so scrunched." I'm like 5'5", very average height, and I feel scrunched. I don't imagine how very tall people deal
exactly.
with
Yeah, I'm
it.
5'4", so I'm
Okay,
like a pretty like small person, and this is already so uncomfortable for me.
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us what family you have out there?
So basically, my entire family is out in
Oh
Korea.
wow,
Oh
My
wow.
okay.
Okay.
parents are actually like the only ones who immigrated elsewhere. We do have extended family in the States, so like great aunts and uncles, and then like my parents' cousins. We have some family like here in Washington, and then a good number of my mom's side of the extended family lives in Colorado. But yeah, everyone else lives in Korea, so all of my sort of like direct aunts and uncles, like my parents' siblings, and then my direct cousins. What are those, second cousins? I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think so.
yeah, they all live in Korea, and then my grandparents as well. So,
Oh
yeah.
wow.
Wow, that's like the opposite of us because like
Yeah,
we're
I was about
most
to
of our
say.
Oh,
family migrated over to
Yes.
the States and there's very few people still in Jamaica. So is there something about the Seattle area that your parents liked or did they have family there prior to migrating that like made them want to go there? Or is it just I don't know, just because I know for our parents like Miami was
Just
very
close to
yeah, close to
Jamaica.
Jamaica.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. if I remember correctly, so my dad was working at Samsung in Korea at the time, and then I guess the company was like, "We'll pay for you to like go to grad school if you want." Back then, they did those things.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was nice. Let's bring that
And
back.
so my dad had applied to like different schools. I think particularly like in I think it was like Sweden, and then maybe Maryland, and then
Oh, okay.
here. And then
Gotcha.
I don't know the exact reasons, but he ended up going to school in Washington State. But we were
Gotcha.
actually out in Eastern Washington. It's like 6 hours away from here. And so I was born out there. It's like the boonies. It's literally like farmland, and then there's like this one college. It's Washington State. It's like wheat fields and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And then we
Gotcha.
actually moved back to Korea for like a year when I was a
wow, okay.
baby. Because
God.
once my dad had finished school, he had to go back to Samsung. He was there for like a year working there. He hated it. He was actually so stressed that he experienced like partial facial paralysis.
Wow.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I only recently found out about that maybe like a few years ago. And so he was like, I hate working here. Let's go back to America, basically. And I had no say. So I was like, okay, here we go. And then at that time, my dad, one of his cousins, or like some of his cousins were living like in the Seattle area. So I think that's why we ended up moving
Okay.
specifically to Seattle. But like we could have ended up in Sweden.
Oh my
I was
gosh.
like, that would have been pretty cool.
Swedish Tammy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty
I
neat.
mean, but then I would have probably never met Brianna, but
Yeah, exactly.
but
Okay, so
What would
they
life
also
be?
like might have moved to Maryland, so it's just funny how like life works that way.
Yeah,
You know.
for sure.
Yeah.
So when you were living, when you were there for a year after your dad had to go back to Samsung, you sound like you were pretty little, right? Like you don't really remember that.
I was like a
experience.
year old, so I really
okay,
have like
yeah.
no
Recollection.
recollection.
Yeah.
I just have like photos.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Right. Back to like current, like, so you live and you grew up in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like a Korean community in Seattle or a big Asian community there?
There definitely is. I never really struggled with like not having other Asian friends growing up. I definitely was. I mean, still to this day, a lot of the friends I grew up with that I'm still close to, like a lot of them are Asian American, and there's a big, I would say, but also like, of course, Asia is a big continent, so
Right.
like mostly here it's a lot of like East Asian folks, so a lot of Korean people, Chinese, some Japanese, but there's certainly Filipino people, Vietnamese people, but I would say there's a large East Asian community. So I grew up in the Catholic Church, and so we went to like a Korean Catholic church for a while. But yeah, there's a good amount of Korean people here, but kind of dispersed here and there. Like where I live, so I live in a suburb. I grew up in a suburb called Bellevue, and then the larger Korean communities exist sort of like geographically, like farther up north and farther south.
Okay.
So those are kind of like where the bigger Korean communities are. But yeah, I still grew up with like Korean friends. I would say my closer friends are probably like Chinese and Japanese, but that wasn't like on purpose or anything. It
Right,
happened to
right.
be that way. Yeah,
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, do you actually speak Korean? Like, can you
I
speak the language?
do.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you're fluent. Awesome.
And can
Yeah.
you talk about how you learned? Like, did you
Yeah.
learn like just from your parents talking to you, or like I read a book called Crying in H Mart. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was really
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
But
I know. I've read it. Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I learned a lot about Korean culture from that book. And,
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
and her mom sent her to like Korean school to like
Right.
learn Korean. I don't know. So how did you learn Korean?
I also went to Korean school, but
Oh,
only for a
okay.
couple years as a child. I think it was like first and second grade. It's like every Friday night from like 7 to 9 or something like that.
Wow.
So that's where I learned to really read and write.
Mhm.
And so that's why my reading and writing level has been stuck at like elementary school level.
That's hilarious.
Like, I can read, but very slowly.
Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
I'm like, everyone be quiet. I need to read this. I need to focus. And then like my handwriting is like just terrible. And then like nowadays I've actually been sort of unstructured learning for myself of just like
Yeah.
trying to read and write a little bit more here and there and just like being more conscious of it. But yeah, speaking wise, so when I was really young, starting at around like 10 years old, my dad actually went back to school. So we like didn't have an income and my parents were like, how are we going to live? And so
Yeah. Yeah.
um we actually started hosting Korean students at our house.
Oh,
Ah, okay.
wow.
So oftentimes kids in like middle school and high school would come for like a year and they'd do school here to like properly learn English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like obviously those kids needed a place to stay, so they would stay at our house. And I think a lot of my Korean developed when those kids were living with us and I was interacting with them regularly. At least that's what my parents say. My mom will always say like that's where your Korean really started to develop. Like before then,
Mhm.
my mom said that I would like stutter a lot and I like
Mm.
didn't have a very expansive vocabulary. But yeah, and then as I've gotten older, it's just like well, also at home we mostly speak Korean.
Mhm.
We
Yeah.
don't really speak any English. Nowadays for me it's just like watching Korean dramas and
Yeah.
um I still teach voice lessons and so a lot of my students are actually Korean, so I'll
Oh.
communicate with the parents like in Korean too.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So yeah, so how do you feel that has like affected your relationship with the culture? Has I mean, obviously knowing the culture, knowing the language, has probably made you feel even more close to your parents' culture.
Yeah.
How does that, how do you feel about that relationship between knowing the language and how close you are with the culture?
Yeah, I think it's so valuable. I sometimes feel a lot of just sort of like heartbreak when I see other especially other Korean Americans who really don't know the language because I feel
Mhm.
like you're missing out on so much.
Mhm.
Right? With language there are just like so many nuances
Yeah.
and like seeing like English translations for Korean sometimes I'm like I really don't think that this is what this means. But it's like, it's
Yeah.
like there are words or phrases that you just kind of can't
You're right.
translate, right? So when I see people who don't really know Korean, I'm like, you're missing out on so much. There's like just like certain words that you can't convey in English, but also like one of the biggest things for me is like you're kind of missing out on like the fun stuff too, like the humor, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And then I think for me specifically, like just being able to communicate with like my grandparents and my aunts and
Right.
uncles and cousins, like I think the reason why I feel closer to them and I feel like even though there is like so much physical distance between us, I still feel a closeness to them is because I can speak the language. Like,
Yeah.
we can call each other and I don't have to like have my parents translate for us
Yeah.
or anything like that. I can literally just converse with my grandpa, just the two of us. It's so valuable in communicating with your family, but also just like being able to immerse yourself in the culture more. Say you do want to like learn more, then you have the ability to like read books or watch movies and documentaries and TV
Mhm.
shows.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Language definitely like ties people together. Like there's this particular YouTuber I watch. He goes by like Xiaoma NYC. He speaks Chinese. So
Mm.
like a white guy that speaks
Like
Chinese.
Jewish or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think he
Oh,
is.
wait,
Yes,
yes, I think I know who you're
he has like
talking
5 million
He has a
subscribers.
bunch of followers.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
And he just goes on the streets of New York and like pretends like he doesn't know how to speak Chinese and then will just bust out in like fluent Chinese and
Yeah.
like it's amazing when you like the reactions when he starts talking to people and they like are like, oh, he knows our language. Like you can just tell they're like this instant tie. So like definitely like
Right.
watching his videos, it seemed like being able to connect with somebody in their native tongue is so powerful.
Yeah. And like what you said too about a lot of the translations not being completely correct. Like I remember when
Mm.
Squid Game came out, I didn't see it because
Oh, yeah.
I'm too scared. But
It
I
is
remember when,
violent. Yeah.
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 Uh, but when Squid Game came out, I remember seeing all these things of people being like, the translations are all wrong. Like you're not like the
Yeah.
people who watch it with the English subtitles like aren't getting the proper like meaning. And so yeah, I feel like there was even like a big viral video I think some lady made about how like
Oh, I
I
think I
think she
remember that.
pointed
Yeah.
out, yeah, like specific examples of how it was wrong. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's so true. Language is so important with, yeah,
Yeah. I think that's one
understanding.
of the hardest things about translations is that you essentially miss out on like cultural context,
Mm,
Right.
hmm.
right? It's like there are certain things that just don't translate at all to other cultures. And that's the hardest part. But it's like I mean, with modern day technology, like, we have the ability to like translate and whatnot, and I think that's just kind of like a natural limitation that like you can't overcome unless you like actively really try and understand that culture or like are from that culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've touched on language and all of that, but what are some other aspects of Korean culture that your parents really made sure to try and pass down to you and your brother growing up?
I feel like my parents were never very strict about that kind of thing.
Oh,
Like so in Korean, like a lot of other Asian languages, there's like a formal version and then an informal version. So like the formal version you'll use with adults and then also like strangers and other people that you don't really know well. And so my parents were never strict on having my brother and I use like formal language. Some parents are about that kind of thing, but we always spoke very like informally and like colloquially around the house. They really never, yeah. I feel like sometimes they're just so casual and kind of like didn't even care. But then sometimes, and then they'll kind of get mad about like, why don't you like know this thing, or like, why are you ignorant about this thing? And it's like, that's not my fault. You moved us here.
yeah,
I didn't
yeah.
have a choice in that. But yeah, generally they really never like imposed any like strict. Oh, you need to know X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
Or you have to like practice this thing. Even with like holidays, they'd just be like, "It's this thing today. Call your grandpa." And I'd be like, "Okay, sure." You know.
That's so
So
funny.
yeah, in our house it was like very casual.
Okay.
But like for me personally now as an adult, I feel like I'm trying to be more intentional about those kinds of things and like
Yeah.
Yeah.
learning more about like significant holidays.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
your parents were pretty casual about cultural things, but obviously, we've heard and seen so many videos of people kind of talking about Asian parents and finding the humor in how strict they were
Mm-hmm.
about school and making sure you got straight A's. And I feel like there's kind of this stereotype that all Asians are really smart because they study really hard because their parents
Right.
are hard on them about it. So were your parents kind of strict about your grades and doing well in school?
To a certain extent, yeah. So I would say my parents are also like the like more on the educated side of their
Mhm.
generation. So
Mhm.
my parents both have master's degrees. My dad has multiple.
Yeah, it sounds like
Yeah,
it.
and so education has definitely been something that educated side of their generation. But I think also like my brother and I did well in school, and I think we were both like ambitious in our own ways. That we kind of like took care of that ourselves, and so
Mhm.
my mom will often say like, I never really had to like worry about you and your brother when you were younger in terms of like school and grades. But like my mom will also be like, my one dream is for one of my children to go to Harvard. And I'm like, Mom, I don't think that dream is going to come true. You might have to wait for grandchildren, or you might just have to let it go.
Yeah, yeah.
Um but yeah, I mean certainly if we ever got like bad grades or like did kind of poorly in school for like a brief moment, then they'd be like, what's going on?
Right,
Like, do you
yeah.
need tutoring, or like I'm gonna take your phone away?
Right, yeah.
But yeah, they're like in some ways they were very strict, and in other ways they weren't. Like one way I would describe my dad is more like he kind of didn't really care about what we did. He preferred that we would do things that we enjoyed. But if you are gonna do this thing, like do it well, right? It's like you can't do
Mhm.
poorly at this thing,
Mhm.
regardless of what
Mhm.
it is. So it's that kind of like kind of strict, but also not. Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, Tammy and I both studied vocal performance and we're basically training to be opera singers
Mm-hmm.
at this music conservatory in Baltimore. Um, and generally, a lot of times, like if you're not studying something that's putting you on a path towards becoming like a doctor, a lawyer, or like a engineer of some sort, a lot of times, not even just Asian parents, immigrant parents in general are
Right.
not super supportive of it. I mean, like my mom in particular was not always super supportive of. I mean, she was cool with it when I was doing it in high school and middle school and stuff. But then
Right.
when I started to study it in college, she was like, "Are you sure?"
Yeah.
So, like, were your parents supportive of you pursuing music?
They were actually. So my mom is also a musician. So
Oh.
she did her undergrad and master's in music. And then, like I said about my dad earlier, he's like, I don't really care what you guys do. Like, he was really actually really hard on my brother about going to med school. That was one thing that he really pushed on my brother. And at first my brother was like, okay, maybe. And then once he kind of started like going down that route, he was like, okay, I actually really don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And even to this day, sometimes my dad is like, if only he had gone to med school and become a doctor. I'll be like, Dad, that was my brother's in like his mid-30s now. I'm like, Dad, please stop. But yeah, they were definitely very supportive. Though I recently learned, like a year ago, that my mom was like, I wanted you to become a good singer and then to just meet a rich man. I was like, what? You weren't rooting for my success. You were rooting for a certain amount of success that would lead me to
Oh my God.
a rich man. But my dad was like, oh, I wanted you to become, right. As I said earlier, my dad's like, I don't care what you do, but do it well. My dad was like, I wanted you to become like a top opera singer. I
Right.
wanted you to
Yeah.
become like Denise Graves level,
Right. Yeah.
internationally performing singer. I was like, well, that's hard.
Yeah, that is. I mean, we all want. I'm sure you want that for yourself too. Like, yeah, that's hard. That is hard.
Yes, I didn't know about Denise like until Brianna started studying a Peabody, and
Right.
like I was like, oh, okay. Like I was thinking, I don't know, like okay, opera singer, cool. But she was like, no, she's like legit, and I was like, oh wow, she has like a Wikipedia page, and
Yeah.
like has been on Sesame Street and everything. Yeah,
Right.
I was like, wow,
Yeah.
she's like,
That's when you know
legit.
it's real, when someone has a
Yeah.
wiki
Yeah.
page.
And not even, and I was like, I was saying earlier to Alyssa, like, I was like, not even a short Wikipedia page. It's like a pretty
Yeah.
sizable
Hers is
Wikipedia
pretty,
page.
yeah.
Yeah, it has a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's a big deal. Okay, but going back to our conversation. So obviously a big thing now is Korean culture has just blown up. Like
Yeah.
it is having a moment. I think it's called Hallyu. Actually, there's like a term for it of
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
Korean wave right now. So people are obsessed with Korean music, TV shows, skincare even. As a Korean American, what are your thoughts on that? Like, are you proud of it? Is there some feeling of like this is like some weird fad? Like, how do you feel about this like new obsession that's kind of taken over the world, really?
Yeah. It's wild to see truly the whole world like so immersed in this. I've seen like people out in Europe who are like fully obsessed with like Korean culture, like people in like Turkey and Germany, and I'm like, whoa, like that's just so wild. It's really interesting for me, for sure. In some ways, it's definitely really cool. Even my friends who aren't Korean are like, "Oh, have you seen this Korean drama?" And I'm like, "I haven't, but I'm glad you have and enjoyed it. That's cool. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll go watch it now too."
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like again, you lose a lot of cultural context. For example, in Squid Game, I know Brianna, you said you didn't watch it, but maybe you know of like there's like this one part in the show where it's like a sugar candy, and then you
Yeah.
have to like you have to like poke out the image. So that candy kind of blew up after the show, but like the cultural context behind that candy is that like it was really popular. I know for sure when we were children, you know, in the like late 90s and like early 2000s, and you could like go buy it like on the street. Obviously, I didn't live in Korea at that age, so my mom would like sometimes make it for us at home. We had like there's like a little kit, there's like a really tiny little like pot, and you like pour the sugar into it, and I was like, it was so fun.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's like a clump of sugar. It's delicious to like
Yeah.
a child. But nowadays, it's lost a lot of its popularity, and the only people who really sell it are like very elderly women who are poor, and that's kind of their job. They're like on the streets selling these candies for like $1 a piece. Like it's really weird to me. There's like this dissonance of like random people on like TikTok who are like, "Oh, like I'm making the candy from Squid Game." But I'm like, you don't understand that nowadays it's just old poor women who are selling these to just survive
Mhm.
for however long as possible. So I think that's the hardest thing for me. I just care so much about everything in general.
Yeah.
And so I really wish that there was sort of more of that. Whereas like it's just like, oh, following fads and trends, like, oh, this is fun, like this is enjoyable, but it's like that is just like the tip of the iceberg of Korean culture, right? There's so much more that people don't know
Right.
because it's not the popular stuff. Like another example is, I don't know if y'all have heard of this person, Ollie London, I think is their name.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, this British person who's like, I am transcultural.
Yeah.
I identify as Korean, but they're white. Like
Yeah.
straight up British, white. And they're like, I'm transcultural. And they got like, I don't even know how many, but like a ton of plastic surgery to look like a specific BTS member.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I mean, to be real, they look nothing like him. But they've gotten like so much plastic surgery because of like this weird obsession of like, oh, I'm Korean. But like that got me angry because I was like, first of all, you can't do that. No one can do that. That's not a thing, right? But second of all, I was like, when I look back at like my family history, my grandpa served in the Korean War when he was like 17. He's told me stories of how he literally just had to sleep in the snow, don't have a blanket or anything, a bed. He's a teenager losing his friends in a war. Or like my grandma, she was born in Japan after Japanese colonization of Korea. And she didn't actually live in Korea until she was about like 6 or 7. And so, right, even just from my own family, I'm like, there's so much pain and heartbreak here. You
Yeah.
can't just be like, oh, I'm a part of this culture now. I'm like,
Right.
did your grandparents go through any of this stuff? Like, no.
Yeah.
Maybe in a different place, but like, you can't just like suddenly claim a culture as yours. And so, like, obviously that's a more extreme example.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Like, not everyone who's obsessed with like K-pop is like doing the same thing. But that's where my concern comes in. I'm like, okay, great. You can appreciate this culture from afar, but then I feel like there's a fine line between like admiration and then like unhealthy obsession.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, Ollie London is a very extreme example of that, but there are a lot of people who are kind of teetering in between the
Yeah.
two because, like, yeah, apparently there's been a lot of tourism to Korea, which is good, but then a lot of people are coming there thinking they'll find a nice Korean man, like in the K-dramas,
Yeah.
who, like, will fall in love with them and be really sweet. And, like,
Right.
I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Tammy, but I teach English as a second
Yeah, you
language
told
online.
me.
Okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
did tell you. Okay. Korea is a really popular place to teach English for
Mhm.
Americans especially. And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of people just go there because like they have this obsession and they just like want to live there and
Yeah.
like they think they'll live out like some K-drama dreams. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting for sure.
Yeah.
But is there anything about Korean culture that you feel like is not represented in those K-dramas and K-pop music and all of that that you wish people did know about?
I mean, for one thing, as I mentioned earlier, so Japan colonized Korea in like the early 20th century. I think that was actually only like 100 years ago. As I said, like my grandma was born in Japan, and there are still a lot of Korean people who live in Japan from that time period, like from colonization. And so I think in general, just like more historical context. Even with our parents' generation, like my parents will often tell me about how Korea was just such a poor nation, even when they were kids or like in their 20s and 30s. Just the other day, my mom was cutting a watermelon and she was like, oh, yeah, back in the day, we used to eat the rind. And she had never told me that before. I know some cultures do use the rind in cooking. I know, like, in South Asian culture, they use the whole watermelon, but she had never told me that before. And she was like, yeah, we were just like, the whole country was just so poor. Like,
Yeah.
we ate everything that we could. Or, like, my dad would be like, yeah, I would, like, go eat frogs. I would, like, go
Yeah.
catch frogs and eat the frogs. And so that kind of thing. Because now I think people see Korea as like, oh my god, it's so wonderful there. There are like so many cool things. They have great music and great TV shows and like great skincare. But it's like, we've come so far, right? It wasn't always like a wealthy nation. It wasn't always like unicorns and rainbows.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like we came from a very poor place. We came from nothing. And I wish more people knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, because I know that, like, kind of piggybacking off Brandon talking about the K-pop phase and everything. Are you a BTS fan?
I'm
I'm just
actually
curious.
not.
Oh,
I
that's a
don't
good
really
question.
listen to much K-pop. I
Okay.
prefer like ballads and like slow songs.
Okay. Cool.
And I actually didn't really listen to a lot of Korean music as a child. I feel like I grew up more listening to like American like classic rock,
Okay. Cool.
Simon and Garfunkel,
Awesome.
and Enya. I freaking love Enya. People who shit on Enya, stop. She's great.
She does get some flack,
But that
doesn't
was
she?
just because like we listened to this one local radio station that played that kind of music in the car all the
Okay.
time. That was
Gotcha.
just our default. So I like mostly grew up listening to that, and so to like nowadays I just come across random recommendations on. I use Apple Music for music streaming. So I just come upon like random recommendations, and I'm like, oh, this is cool, but it's from like the 1980s. I'm like, why not? Like this is cool. I like
Yeah.
it. So yeah, I'm not like a hardcore
Okay.
K-pop BTS fan, but
I'm not either. I just was curious because I'm trying to
Yeah,
understand
right.
the
Yeah.
obsession.
Yeah.
But their skin is
Yeah.
flawless, I will
Yes.
say. Like they have
Yes.
beautiful
They
skin.
really do have flawless. Like I'm very
It's the
jealous.
I am
skincare.
Yeah, I'm so jealous. Yeah. But it seems like maybe you are more into the K dramas. Do you watch K dramas?
I do, yeah, pretty regularly. It's easy to get sucked into them because I feel like, well, so I didn't really like them as much when I was a kid because they were like super cheesy and like over
Yeah.
the top.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever seen those like Bollywood clips where it like makes no sense? It's like someone punches someone and then they fly across like
Right. Yeah.
a
yeah.
lake and then they like end up in a suitcase. You know, it's like stuff like that. It's just like so dramatic and cheesy. I was like, this is terrible. I'm gonna like go watch MTV or something. And then like more recently, I've just been like watching them here and there, and
Yeah.
I've just found that like in general, I feel like production quality is like much better.
Yeah.
The themes are like less cheesy and dramatic, kind of more rooted in like reality. So I've definitely been enjoying them a lot more lately.
Delving a bit more into the culture, I have a bit of a story. So,
Yeah.
as we mentioned, Tammy and I went to a music
Oh, you
conservatory.
did? You mentioned that?
I know. We can cut some parts out.
Wait,
but
I don't
just
think
wanna-
I knew that either.
I love it. I love
all
it.
right.
Yes.
Well, anyway, Tammy and I were in school, and when you study vocal performance at a university in the U.S. at least, at the end of your degree program, you have a recital. And so obviously we all had recitals. Tammy had her recital, and let me tell you, it was so good. And after the recitals at our school, people would often have receptions where they would serve food for their audience. And Tammy's reception was the best reception
Oh my God,
ever
stop.
because she and her family served Korean food. I had never tried Korean food before, and it was so good. Like I still remember it. And I remember you served you had leftovers the next day and you like texted some of your friends and were like, hey, you guys want some leftovers? And we like ran over to your apartment to eat those leftovers because it was so good. So I'm just telling that story to say that my eyes were open to how great Korean food was because of Tammy. And so, Tammy, can you tell us some of your favorite Korean foods and like maybe kind of describe them as well?
Oh my God, I love that. I love that you remember that and that like
Seriously,
holds like a special place in your heart.
it does.
Originally, my mom really wanted to make that food herself, but it just
Mm.
ended up being like way too much work because like
Yeah.
Yeah.
the Korean grocery store out in Baltimore was like half an hour away, and like it just would have taken like too much time, and so we ended up just like catering from one of the local restaurants. But I'm so glad you loved it. For me, I definitely like, you know, some of the popular dishes. Like one called tteokbokki. It's like spicy rice cakes. I think I had that at my reception. They're like usually sort of short and circular rice cakes, and it's in like spicy in a sort of spicy sauce. Then people will add maybe other things like hard boiled eggs or like onions. And then kimbap is also, it's kind of like Korean sushi. It's just like sushi rolls, and you can put like a variety of things in that too. It's like usually like veggies and then maybe like some kind of beef. But I also just like, oh, I think this is a kind of common in a lot of Asian cultures, but it's like hearty stews and soups. Actually, I feel like that's also common in more like Caribbean culture as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I really love like all kinds of like hearty soups. I just finished off one that my mom made. It's like a spicy beef soup.
Ooh, sounds good.
Yeah. It's just like so healthy. It's like a lot of vegetables and like protein. And then usually like you'll have it with rice. Yeah, we have a lot of like beef based soups. I also like one called samgyetang, which is like a chicken soup. So yeah, I'm all about like the comfort food, the things
Yeah.
that make you feel warm inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're getting to our like sort of ending questions. So
Hmm.
we've been trying these out. We'll see if we continue with them. But so I always ask about one thing you dislike about your family's culture and one thing you really love about your family's culture. So first, can you tell us what's one thing that you maybe dislike a little bit about Korean culture?
Yeah, and if you don't feel comfortable answering that, that's
Yeah.
okay too. Yeah.
Oh no, I definitely have things I don't
Tammy's like, I have a list.
It is not perfect for sure. I think one thing that's really grinds my gears about Korean culture is that people tend to be very prideful. So really put up a front to like create a reputation for themselves, or right, it's like very elitist in some ways. It's like, I got into like, we have the Korean Ivy League is kind of like three really big schools. So it's like my children got into these schools, or like my children work at like really big fancy companies like LG or Samsung or whatever. That's definitely one thing that I really dislike. But I feel like that is kind of present in a lot of like Asian cultures, because I feel like it kind of just like closes people off from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like my mom also has some friends who are like annoyingly competitive with each other. I'm just like, what is the point? Are you really friends? No. I don't know. Yeah. And then in terms of something that I really like, when I was reading through the questions that you sent me, there was one thing that I was thinking of was I actually really like the writing system, how the sort of like alphabet works. Korean was very heavily influenced by Chinese, but Chinese is way more complex. Korean is
Mm-hmm.
actually really quite simple. And so I think I'm just like always just kind of fascinated by that and like how it's structured. Kind of nerdy for me to say.
Yeah. No, but it's true. Like, yeah, I've heard someone say that the Korean alphabet is actually quite easy to learn and you can learn
Yeah.
it in like a day. And yeah, and like I said, I've seen a lot of videos of people teaching English over there in Korea, and
Right.
that's like their main tip to anyone else who wants to go over there and teach is that like just learn the alphabet. Like if you can't
Yeah.
learn the language, like just at least try and learn the alphabet because you can at least like read things a little bit.
Mhm.
So yeah. Okay, and then another thing that we have been doing with everyone a little bit is kind of trying to dispel some stereotypes about your culture. So I've come up
Stereotype
with
Mythbusters. You still don't like
yeah,
that
we
name.
still don't love that
Okay,
name,
that's
but
fine.
we'll think about it.
We're not sure if we're
Um
sticking with that segment either.
so
Culture busters?
no, just
Stereotype Mythbusters.
stereotype mythbusters. I don't know. I think we could come up with something
We're
a
not sure if we're
little more
sticking with that
creative than that,
segment.
but
Yeah.
okay.
We're trying to find a segment that'll
Right.
be
Yeah,
interesting.
we're a work in progress here. So I've come up with the three main stereotypes that I kind of want to ask you about. So the first one I think is kind of like a pan-Asian stereotype, but I feel like South Korea is pretty hardcore with it, and that is just like how hard people study and how hard people work
Mm,
there. Do you feel like even amongst other Asian countries, maybe like Korea's pretty hardcore with their study and work culture?
I would say so. I can't say that I know too much about how other Asian cultures operate, because I'm pretty sure Japan has like one of the
That's
highest
true.
like work exhaustion related deaths. Like
Hmm.
people literally working like 20 hours a day and then they like collapse on the subway
I have
on
heard
the
that. That's
way
true.
home. But for sure, school and studying is like very hardcore in Korea. It's not really so much because most people go to public schools. Private school isn't like a huge thing in Korea, so most people just go through the public school system. And school itself isn't like super hardcore, as in like they're not like constantly giving out like a ton of homework and whatnot. It's more like the education system at large. So like students go to like tutoring and like extracurriculars after school until often like late at night. They'll be done at like 10 p.m. And then there's actually a great recent Korean drama about this, about the super like big time popular math tutor in Korea. He is like part of like this sort of extra, we call them hagwons, which is kind of like after school.
Okay.
And so he specializes in math, but I think it shows a lot of the reality of like these moms wake up at like 6 in the morning to like rush to the line to make sure that their kids are getting signed up. And then because I've never lived there and experienced this myself, this was also like new information to me of like, even if you get in the class, oftentimes there's like 50 kids in this class and it's like lecture based. So, you know, kids are just like watching. And so sometimes like you also have to like make an extra effort so that your kid is sitting in the front of the class so that they can see the whiteboard well. And so that kind of thing, it's like very intense. You'll also see in that show of parents sort of doing like illegal things of like trying to get their kids ahead. The example in the show is that like one mom works with like a school administrator to get the exact test. And so she tells her son, practice these problems for your test tomorrow. But it turns out it's the exact test. And so, right, like he already knows all the answers. But he didn't know that his mom had done that. And so he's like, when he finishes the test, he's like in shock. He's like, oh, what the heck? My mom has like cheated the system. So yeah, education is super hardcore, but that's not to say that everyone can do that, right? Because it's costly, right? Like
Yeah.
these things are expensive. So again, that's where you kind of see where you're sort of missing his cultural context. It's like not everyone is doing that because not everyone can. And then it's also kind of different depending on where you are geographically in Korea. So like that is very intense in like your bigger cities, obviously. Like if you live in a smaller city or kind of out in the boonies, then like you just don't even have access to those kinds of resources.
Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of things about how much stress is on students sometimes, and that there's this really big exam at the end of the year that literally the whole like country shuts down for basically, and then
Yeah.
yeah, and like everyone's trying to like cheer on the students for this exam. And I think I've actually heard that they recently made it a little bit easier just because they were trying to encourage people to have more kids, and they felt like it was actually a deterrent. I think I heard
That makes
about that
sense. I
recently.
haven't heard that, but that actually kind of makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Korean government is trying to help our generation with like trying to increase population, but
Yeah.
it's rough out here.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. And then another stereotype I saw, just like a small one, and really it's kind of like something that it's again a kind of across East Asians, is that Koreans and East Asians in general really love taking selfies. Is that something that you've noticed, I guess?
Definitely, yeah. Like, but not everyone. It's like the people who are kind of like more obsessed with like social media, people who
Mm-hmm.
like want to become influencers,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. Definitely amongst that kind of group, I would say. But yeah, I don't think we're all born with selfie sticks out of the womb.
No. I've never been a selfie person
Yeah.
myself. Yeah. And the last stereotype, and probably maybe the last question or so, is about the beauty standards in Korea.
Mm.
Just that they're very high, and that a lot of young girls, especially, will actually ask their parents for plastic surgery when they're like still in school to kind of
Yeah.
meet those beauty standards. Yeah. Is that something that you've heard about? And
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, a very true stereotype, unfortunately. People are very obsessed with like physical appearance. So, as you said, a lot of even young students will get plastic surgery. It's not always like a big thing because like Asians are more known for monolids. Like a lot of people
Mhm.
will get like double eyelid surgery. That's probably like the most common thing, and then I feel like a lot of people get work done on their noses. And then some people try and like enlarge their eyes. You can like cut small slits apparently
My
on the
Oh
like
gosh.
wow.
corners of your eyes. But yeah, it's quite common. I would say I definitely have cousins who have gotten some plastic surgery done here and there. Yeah, it's very common. I've had family members and like family friends tell me I should get plastic
Oh my
surgery.
gosh.
And a common thing is like, oftentimes people will get work done as like a gift. So it's like, oh, you graduated from high school? All right, let's get you some plastic surgery. Yeah, it's so weird.
Wow.
I'm like, oh.
Thank you.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if that's
You're
a-
telling me I'm ugly, but I won't be soon.
Right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty crazy to me, but
Yeah.
no, yeah.
I think it's
cultural
really
differences.
unfortunate. It's like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
being a plastic surgeon is definitely like a high profile job in Korea.
Mhm.
So, like,
Mhm.
get a lot of respect because, plastic surgery is just so common. And it's just like really sad to see, especially like young people so obsessed with how they look. But the interesting thing though is that it's not super like gender specific. It's not really only women who get it done. A lot of men get work done. Nowadays, actually, a lot of men get like their eyebrows tattooed. I know also a lot of men, this isn't plastic surgery, but more like appearance based. Like a lot of men get like body hair wax.
Mm-hmm.
So it is interesting though that it's not only just like an obsession amongst women. It's kind of everyone. Also like varying age groups. Like I've seen like older men with their eyebrows tattooed. And that was certainly surprising to me because I've never seen that before.
Age is just a
Yeah.
number.
Yeah, and I mean, I
Right.
guess these men have to live up to BTS members. Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
True.
and their gorgeous skin. So, yeah. All right. I think that is it for today. I think those are pretty much
Yeah.
all of our questions. Alyssa, do you have any final questions for Tammi?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of material. I feel like I learned
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
lot.
we
And,
did.
and
Yeah.
Tammi, thank you so much for just taking the time to speak with us and share your side of the story. It's always so interesting to hear just, what other people's upbringing is like. Yeah, so we really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad that I got that text from Brianna. I was like, this sounds so cool.
Thank you to Tammi for taking the time to meet with us and share her story as a Korean American. I think one of my favorite parts of the interview was when we got onto the topic of music and Enya came up. Did not see that coming, but it was fabulous. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode. We hope you join us for a new show coming out soon. If you like what you hear, we would really appreciate it if you left us a review on your podcast player of choice. As a new podcast, this really helps us out and helps us extend our reach so that others can hear the wonderful interviews from our guests. Thank you for listening in, and catch you next time.